Okay, so this is the lecture on Islam, part two of the lecture. So we're picking up with talking about the spread of Islam, and specifically its spread eastward at this point into India and Pakistan. So in India, under Muslim rule originally and typically, the Hindu majority in India was granted dhimmi status. Remember, dhimmi status means like protected people, where their religious differences were tolerated. Typically, that status was also given to Jews and Christians under Muslim rule, who were protected as people of the book because Jews and Christians were perceived by Muslims as worshiping the same God and sharing the same strand of sacred history. So that was also at times granted to the Hindu majority. The Mughal emperor, so the Mughal Empire was an Islamic empire that was established in India. One of the early emperors of this empire was Akbar, who was so sort of pluralistic, according to legend and typical depictions of him, that he even commissioned the building of Hindu temples. However, not all of the emperors were pluralistic or even tolerant of Hinduism and other beliefs and practices. So in India, over centuries, tensions grew between Hindus and Muslims. Eventually, West and East Pakistan was broken off of India to become a Muslim ruled country. The creation, quote, the creation of Pakistan was one of the major contemporary attempts to create a model nation based on the principles of Islam. Muhammad Ali Jinnah conceived of it as a modern democratic state in which women and minority rights would be respected. However, ethnic and cultural divisions have prevented this realization, and strife continues between Hindus and Muslims within India, and also strife between Pakistan and India. What's interesting is that Pakistan, which was a Muslim majority country that was conceived to be based on the principles of Islam and not necessarily be secular, had a female prime minister in 1988, Benazir Bhutto. So I think that's important to note for some people in the West that have an Islamophobic caricature of Islam as much more misogynistic than Western traditions and Western culture, to note that they had Pakistan, a modern Muslim country, had a female leader as early as 1988, when that hasn't happened in the United States. And that's, to have a female leader doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a lot of misogyny and patriarchy within the society, but that I think just that noting that sort of chips away maybe a little bit at caricatures of Islam as necessarily more misogynistic or more, quote, backward when it comes to gender equality. Muslim traders and missionaries landed in Indonesia as early as the 10th century of the Common Era. And nearly 90% of the people in Indonesia are now Sunni Muslims, but the government had thus far preserved a secular, pluralistic society rather than establish Islam as a state religion, as some Islamist groups have sporadically tried to do. China and Russia have tens of millions of Muslims. There are 1 million, I think it's pronounced Uyghurs. I've mostly read about this, and so I'm not positive about the pronunciation, but Uyghurs are a Turkish-speaking Muslim group that resides in Western China, in an area that really should be that they should have their own state, but it's under Chinese rule. And currently, the Chinese government is detaining about 1 million of them in concentration camps right now. And the concentration camps seek to re-educate them, and are really the religious differences between the Uyghurs as Muslims versus what's supposedly like a secular China, is what is the ideology behind this, but it's a pretty grisly situation. Islam spread into Africa through lines of trade. Some converted, many others maintained some of their indigenous ways in combination with Islam. As the spread of Islam encompassed an increasing diversity of cultures, Hajj, remember the pilgrimage to Mecca, became important not only for individuals, but also a meeting ground for scholars and the religion as a whole, holding its center in Mecca in the midst of worldwide variation. Relationships with the West. So medieval Christian Europe was highly exclusivist. Quote, the church depicted Muhammad as an idol worshiper, an antichrist, the prince of darkness. Muhammad was depicted as a false god worshipped by Muslims, hence Islam was often referred to as Mohammedanism. By the 19th century, Western scholars began to study the Arabic classics, but still there's much ignorance and stereotyping that continues till today. Partially due to Mongol invasions in the 13th century, the Muslim world fell into decline. Traditional Muslims, typically blame this decline on their own spiritual laxness, and the decline is sort of a punishment by God for spiritual laxness. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, many Muslim populations fell under European domination. From the mid 20th century onward, so it was a lot of the Muslim world was colonized and dominated by Europeans during the spread of capitalism and the colonial period. And we've spoken at many points in other lectures about sort of the violence and coercion involved in that history and sort of the exploitation of colonized populations. But from like about the mid 20th century onward, most states gained their independence and adopted certain Western ideals and practices. There were wide-ranging programs of modernization unleashed throughout the Muslim world. Sorry for the typos. This big, dramatic cultural shift that was instigated through violent, coercive colonial practices from a cultural outsider led to fragmentation of society and local traditional authorities. It was a very violent upheaval, economically, but also like socially and culturally for this region. The textbook suggests that many scholars believe that the establishment of Israel was to protect Western interests and to have like a Western-controlled, Western-backed state in the Middle East. At the time of this lecture, which is like July 3rd, 2020, Israel has plans to annex parts of the Palestinian West Bank in a matter of days, which will lead to quite a bit of turmoil. And we spoke when we did the lecture on Judaism about sort of the situation there and the violation of Palestinians' human rights during the establishment of Israel, and how Palestinians have fought back against this very powerful Western-backed state of Israel. And that a typical solution was like a two-state solution where Israel should be allowed to exist, but that Palestinians need to be granted independence in their own state so that they can start making their own policy decisions and have their own governance in order to improve their quality of life. So this annexation is an extremely aggressive move on the part of Israel. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the United States and maybe the second largest religion in the country. It is often made up of African American converts as well as immigrants and their children from South Asia and various Arab countries. Conversion to Islam by African Americans was encouraged in the early 20th century as a form of separatism from the white oppressor. So it is true that many slaves that were taken from West Africa to the United States were originally Muslim. And so a lot of African Americans see Christianity as a white religion that was forced upon them, and that Christianity was in the Bible were interpreted in ways to justify slavery historically in the United States and to justify racism. So a lot of African Americans want to reject that and return to Islam as a more authentically African tradition and a more authentic and having a more authentic relationship to that tradition than Christianity. However, Christianity is also extremely popular among African Americans and interpreted in a way that is anti-racist. And Christian churches within many African American communities are sort of the heart of the community and provide a lot of resources and support for those communities. So that's important to acknowledge too. But as I said, many slaves from West Africa that were brought to the New World were Muslim. Oloda Equiano lived in the 18th century, and he was a West African slave that was brought to the Caribbean who was a literate Muslim and was able to write about his own experience. Elijah Muhammad founded the Nation of Islam, which was sort of a black nationalist movement in the United States that sought to convert African Americans to Islam and had a lot of beliefs that were very unique to itself that weren't really part of other forms of Islam or very unorthodox or unconventional compared to other forms of Islam. Malcolm X was part of the Nation of Islam and identified with that particular branch until he went on the Hajj to Mecca and learned about how Islam is interpreted and practiced in other parts of the world and how far the Nation of Islam is from orthodoxy, and then just began to identify as a Muslim. There are 20 million Muslims in Western Europe. In France, there was a secular ban on headscarves in 2004, and face veils were banned in public places in 2011. This sort of shift in Western Europe has led to negative right-wing and nationalist responses that are accompanying the growth of Islam in Europe. A lot of Muslims in Western Europe are refugees or fleeing really politically unstable parts of the world that are unstable because of the history of European colonialism and intervention. There's an increase in literacy, urbanization, and communications that has helped spread revived interest in Islam. In the process of decolonization, 43 primarily Islamic nation states have been created. There's great diversity among them, and they vary in degree to which society is ruled by Islamic ethics. And again, an Islamist is a type of Muslim, and Islamists are those who seek to establish Islamic states in which the sovereignty of God is supreme. So they would want some version of Sharia law to be entwined with the political and governmental law of the state. However, again, there is no single consensus on what Sharia law is or looks like, or even the method to which humans are able to arrive at the content of Sharia law. Much of the discourse regarding Islam, particularly in the Western world, focuses on Sharia, especially with respect to women's roles in public and private life. So, in sort of an Islamophobic overgeneralization about Islam, there is this fixation that all Muslims are Islamists that have a really primitive or brutal interpretation of Sharia that they always want to govern the political law of the land. And there's a demonization of Sharia based on it always being associated with severe restrictions on women. And so I want to unpack this a little bit. So there are many different voices in Islam regarding the practice of faith in the modern world and the role of Sharia, as well as the content of Sharia. So Iran and Saudi Arabia are more traditional where there is sort of like fasting is enforced, etc., and women are required to wear hijab. So hijab is associated with veiling or head covering. However, hijab just refers to modesty, and it is required for men to be modest too. The textbook says Sharia has been locally adapted to various societies over the centuries. Some feel that to attempt to restore its original form is to deny the usefulness of its flexibility. So, like in Christianity, how there are fundamentalists and some extremists that want a theocracy, that think that their idea of the original form of Christianity is what should be in existence and practiced. There is some of that in Islam, but there is also a more progressive or liberal understanding that as the tradition changes over time, those changes might be part of God's divine revelation of the tradition, that there is a more flexible understanding of the role of human interpretation of the religion over time that isn't necessarily a bad thing. What's important to note is that with Islam, sometimes cultural practices have become assumed as religious practices. So the Quran does not state explicitly that women need to be veiled. It does say that that both men and women need to be modest. However, in the cultural context of the Prophet Muhammad, being a woman and being modest would involve having head coverings. And even at the time in Christendom, women wore veils and head coverings. That's why in Western art, you see the Virgin Mary always wearing a head, and women always wearing head coverings. Veiling was a very common practice throughout the world, not just associated with Islam. In English, the word wife comes from an older English word that means to be veiled. So to be married in parts of the West also meant to be required to wear a veil as a part of modesty. And so some Muslims reject the veiling. Some women don't find the veiling necessary. It's a matter of the interpretation of what modesty means. And some Muslim feminists have claimed that the veiling to them is actually like a feminist expression that fights against the over sexualization and objectification of women. There are also patriarchal interpretations where women need to veil because men can't, and this is not just misogynistic, this is like a very negative view of men, that men can't control their sexual desires and are sexually aggressive and out of control. And so it's women's responsibility to be extremely modest, to accommodate men's poor behavior and self-control when it comes to sex. So there's a lot, this is a complex issue and there's lots of ways of looking at it, and it can be very contextual. So another quote from the textbook: there is as yet no consensus among Muslim majority states about how to establish a peaceful, just, modern society based on basic Muslim principles. Islam is the fastest growing religion with more than 1.2 billion followers. Madrasas were religious schools teaching a very narrow version of Islam, an Islamist interpretation of Islam, but also like a militant, very aggressive form of Islam. There were controversies over the content of textbooks in Pakistan. And at the same time, efforts are being made in some countries to increase the accuracy and sensitivity of portrayals of Islam in the education of non-Muslims. So there is an attempt in some parts of North America and Europe and possibly other parts of the world to be mindful about Eurocentric histories. So we talked about this at the beginning of this lecture, where like being educated, didn't learn nothing in high school about Islam or Islamic empires or history or anything related to that. And there was a very Eurocentric view of history that I was taught. And so there does seem to be some effort to remedy that. So that'd be something interesting to talk about in the discussion post for this lecture is like where were you educated and what did you learn in high school about Islam and in Islamic history? And then because of zakat as being a major pillar of Islam, there are massive philanthropic projects that are funded by Muslims and they're on the rise. So again, Islam and politics. We have to understand what we see going on in the Muslim world and in relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. That we have to understand and be sensitive to the violent history of colonialism in Muslim-dominated countries. Quote, there were many Muslims who grew increasingly discontented with what they understood to be the creeping secularization and growing moral decline of their societies, including corruption in government, as well as the ubiquity of authoritarian rule. So I'm going to kind of unpack this a little bit using a particular example. So in Iran, in the early 20th century, there was established a secular democracy in Iran. And Iran was a Muslim majority country, specifically Shiite Muslim. It's a Shia majority country, but it was a pretty secular, very modern country at the time. So the secular democratically elected government of Iran wanted to basically socialize the oil there and resources there and kind of become a more democratic socialist country. The economic elite in the United States didn't like that move because it would impact the relationship they had in Iran with the economic elite in Iran and have economic problematic economic consequences for the United States. So the United States had, based on oil, had an economic interest in preventing Iran from socializing oil. So the United States helped depose the democratically elected government and dissolve that government in Iran and helped establish a US-backed dictatorship in Iran and installed the Shah, who was a dictator. So the leader was the Shah, who was a dictator. And the dictator was a dictator, and it was a pretty brutal situation. So because of this, the people of Iran were very upset with the US, and the public opinion and perception of this led to a sort of religious fervor. So there was a revolution in 1979, the Iranian Revolution, that overthrew the dictatorship, the US-backed dictatorship in Iran, and got rid of the Shah, and instead established a very religiously conservative Muslim government. So today in Iran, there are a lot of restrictions on women, and there is a very conservative adaptation of Sharia law. You might have heard the Ayatollah is the like sort of religious leader, as well as a secular leader that isn't secular but just works with the religious leadership. And there really is no separation of church and state. So that's an interesting example of how there was like a secular government, and because of U.S. involvement, Iran became a deeply religious, sort of fundamentalist Islamist country. No value judgments against that, but I'm just saying like this is a lot of people don't understand this history, and there have been conflicts with Iran since 1979, and often in the media in the United States it's like just this the clash of civilizations, these angry Muslim, Middle Eastern people just hate us and we don't know why. It's like, you guys, we overthrew their government, their democratic government, basically because of oil, and replaced it with a brutal dictatorship, and that radicalized the population religiously when it wouldn't have. And now there is a Islamist government that is very hostile to the United States. So I think like this is just one country's example. We can do this with like every major Muslim country throughout that region. So to move on, the textbook says, in part, secular and colonialist policies in the Middle East after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was basically the last major Islamic empire, had led to a decline in traditional Islamic learning. That part of the destabilization of European colonialism was a lack of proper and good education in the interpretation of Sharia and understanding the Quran and of Islam. So to give an example of like sort of the cultural upheaval that this secularization um, led to, Ataturk, was the leader of Turkey, changed the alphabet of the Turkish language from Arabic to Roman. So imagine like living in a country and like living in the United States, and then all of a sudden our alphabet script instantaneously from the government top down, it was decided that we would be using Arabic script instead of the alphabet to communicate English as a written language. Muhammad ibn Abd al Wahhab was highly and culturally and religiously conservative, and he became very popular in a lot of decolonized regions. Again, this sort of like move towards a very conservative and more religiously fervor based like interpretation of Islam seems to be a backlash against the social, cultural, and economic upheaval of European colonialism. Sayyid Qutb was disgusted by Western culture and saw the West as a source of evil and moral decline, and he became an influential figure for Islamists. So this does exist. There is a popularity of Islamists. Not all Islamists are terrorists, but a lot of this conservatism is a backlash against like very real violence and upheaval caused by the West in Muslim majority parts of the world. So the word jihad means striving. It does not mean holy war. The word crusade is a Christian word for holy war. So jihad typically is viewed by traditional Muslims as having two types of meaning. So the greater jihad is the struggle against the lower self. So the more important jihad for Muslims is the jihad or struggle against temptation to sin within oneself. The lesser jihad is an external effort to protect the way of God against forces of evil. And based on the Quran, this lesser jihad that gets interpreted as like holy war, it's really explicit that it should never be undertaken for political gain and that believers simply have the right to resist oppression. The textbook says support can be found in the Quran for both a pacifist approach and for active opposition to unbelievers. And a mujahid is a fighter in the path of God. There is no current political unity among Muslim states, and a lot of Muslim states don't get along well with each other. There are forms of Islamist extremism. The Taliban were radical authoritarians from Afghanistan. They still have a stronghold in Afghanistan. They have little tolerance either for other religions or for interpretations of Islam other than their own. They have placed extremely severe restrictions on women and have denied women education. Al Qaeda was the terrorist organization that led to 9/11. Osama bin Laden helped found it. It was opposed, Osama bin Laden is from Saudi Arabia, and he was opposed to the westernization of Saudi society. A lot of Islamist extremists come from Saudi Arabia, which is a U.S. ally because it is very oil rich, even though it's a brutal Islamist monarchy that is very cruel to women and has a lot of human rights abuses. The US has remained an ally of it because maybe it is extremely oil rich. There were military attacks by the U.S. against against Al Qaeda, and in Afghanistan, and the Taliban's power had receded. Yet Afghanistan remains war torn and poverty stricken, and this is always a constantly evolving situation that we still have occupied Afghanistan. In the aftermath of 9/11, President Bush launched the war in Iraq and did so in a way that led many Americans to believe that the war in Iraq, and the attempt to overthrow Saddam Hussein, who was the leader, the dictator of Iraq, was our revenge for 9/11. When Iraq and Osama bin Laden had nothing to do with 9/11. It was Al Qaeda, which was a terrorist organization that was not in Iraq. So that's important to note. Authoritarian rule, so absolute monarchies and military regimes, has destabilized Muslim countries. Often, Western countries and the US backed authoritarian rule of these regions, like the example I gave in Iran, where the US helped make possible the overthrow of a democratic government and the establishment of a dictatorship in Iran. And these authoritarian military regimes led to extreme poverty and deep discontent within these countries. What's referred to as the Arab Spring began in 2010. This is the textbook's description. People took to the streets demanding better conditions and a greater voice in their own affairs. These demonstrations were spontaneous and had no designated leaders. They were therefore easily usurped by organized political groups and led to intervention by foreign powers. You might have heard of the war in Syria. Syria was run by well-funded, well-organized, and well-armed terrorist groups. They engaged in behavior that a majority of Muslims consider criminal and reprehensible, and they engaged in suicidal terrorist attacks, even though those tactics are directly forbidden by the Quran. Relations with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a powerful force because it is oil rich, controlled by a monarchy. It's extremely religiously conservative. It has a legal system based on Sharia and Wahhabism. We talked about al-Wahhab as this extremely conservative figure. Women in Saudi Arabia couldn't drive or leave the house without a close male relative until June 2018. And political leaders in the US really cozy up, basically, to Saudi Arabia and the monarchy. Islam in politics. So you have the Islamic State, or ISIS, which was a violent militant group under the leadership of the late Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. It was an offshoot of al-Qaeda. It declared itself a new caliphate, claiming territory in Iraq and Syria. A group of 126 international Islamic scholars wrote a lengthy open letter to al-Baghdadi using classical Islamic texts to refute the group's tactics. As a result of wars in various Muslim countries, such as internal fighting in South Sudan, wars between nations, military attacks led by the US in Iraq and Afghanistan, natural disasters, and climate change, millions of Muslims now live as refugees or internally displaced persons. So this is an interpretation by the textbook, but many people are citing the civil war and unrest in Syria as directly a result of extreme, unprecedented drought that is directly perceived to be related to climate change, that led to political, economic, and social turmoil that created room for violent terrorist uprisings. There's increasing tension between Muslims and non-Muslims in the West. The textbook says the United States war on terrorism has brought an increase in acts of terrorism and made it more difficult for moderate Muslim leaders to hold their ground against critics within their countries. The Quran permits the jihad of violence only under very specific conditions. People must be deprived of their right to live and support themselves. Action must be undertaken not by individuals, but by the collective wisdom of the Ummah or Muslim community. You may not harm women, children, or unarmed civilians, and you cannot willfully destroy property. Therefore, explicitly according to the Quran, terrorist tactics are not permitted. Some people argue that there has been a deliberate Western policy of portraying conflicts as religion-based struggles in order to fan fear of a threat to the Western way of life from Islam, thus steering Western electorates to support a war on terror with an underlying agenda of controlling oil-rich lands belonging to Muslims. So that's from the textbook. So there is like this general, by many experts that look at these relations, that there seems to have been a campaign to make most Americans and people in the West think that this violence and this struggle is between Islam and like Christianity, or Islam and the West, in a very simplified and ignorant way, to avoid understanding where the conflict and struggles have arisen from in the Muslim world, to be accountable for the history of European colonialism and how that has impacted the region, and the really like vigorously and violently anti-democratic intervention on the part of the U.S. and other Western countries in the quote Muslim world. It's much easier for people to think, oh, it's just these Muslims that are terrorists that have this terrible religion, rather than taking accountability and becoming educated about some of the context and nuance and history involved that has led to conflict and tension with that part of the world. So as Islam and terrorism, some things to point out, and I'm happy to point you to resources for where I'm getting this information. Most incidents of domestic terrorism in the US are committed by far-right extremists and white supremacists, hands down. Most victims of Islamic terrorism globally are other Muslims. So when non-Muslims think that all Muslims, all like 1.2 billion people, need to apologize for the actions of a small minority of Muslim extremists and terrorists, that would be like asking all Christians to apologize for the KKK, which is a Christian hate group, and the KKK is explicitly Christian. So the other thing to be sensitive of is that most terrorist actions committed by Muslims are often committed against other Muslims. In Syria, ISIS was mostly murdering and torturing and terrorizing other Muslims in Syria. Those are the primary victims of Islamic extremism. So to ask Muslims to apologize for extremism, of which they are often more likely the victims of, is a really insensitive misunderstanding of the vastness of Islam, the diversity within Islam, and some basic history about why different forms of Islam and Islamic extremism exist in the first place. Many scholars are interested in the question of why there are not more acts of terrorism against the West, given the violent histories of European colonialism and geopolitical dynamics within the last few centuries. And an answer that's sometimes given is that Islam as a religion actually influences Muslims to be less violent towards aggressors. That's actually a hypothesis. Islam for the future. Global conferences with Muslim intellectuals and scholars have happened to formulate unified responses to current issues. A rapprochement between Sunni and Shia is occurring on some levels, with the understanding that their differences are not so much matters of religious doctrine as of historical conflicts over leadership. Religious modernists, Islamists, and secularists are all trying to understand the roots of extremism and to seek new ways of relating to and even shaping the rapidly changing world. Extremism is seen as contradicting Islamic principles and spreading hatred for the religion. So, the vast majority of Muslims are not extremists, identify extremists as a problem mostly imminently towards themselves, and also are critical of it in a very vocal way. So when you hear that argument that, like, why aren't all Muslims apologizing for extremism? Within the Ummah, there is a constant conversation about the problem of extremism. So the last slide seems a bit out of place, but there is often a concern by people that are Islamophobic in the United States or have bigotry towards other Muslims because Muslims want Sharia. So, as we mentioned before, not all Muslims are Islamists. Hardly any Muslims that come to the United States are Islamist in any way, shape, or form. So I just want to spend a minute talking about the concept of separation of church and state in the U.S. So one thing to point out is that a lot of Christians historically have made the argument that the United States is a Christian nation and want to use the US government to impose particular Christian beliefs, values, and norms on the society. So that is a form of theocracy, and that would be akin to like establishing a Christian law, establishing a Sharia law. So that's happening constantly. So I think it's important to have a reminder that the founding fathers of the US Constitution were mostly not Christian. The vast majority of them were deists. Like Thomas Jefferson, for example, was so explicitly not Christian that he took the account of Jesus in the Gospels, consistently wrote against believing in the supernatural as superstition, looked at the account of Jesus in the Gospels because of his uh, a disdain for supernaturalism, took out all of Jesus' miracles and claims to divinity, and published the moral teachings of Jesus, because he believed that's all you should take from Jesus in Christianity, is that Jesus was a profound moral philosopher. So the idea of the founding fathers as Christian and establishing a Christian nation is pretty misguided. There is the only reference in the founding documents to God is that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. And that's because as deists, they believed there was a Creator, but that this Creator in no way interacts with creation after having been created. One nation under God was added to our Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s under Eisenhower, as was In God We Trust to our currency. These were added as part of propaganda during the Cold War to emphasize the U.S. as this God-fearing nation and as communists, as like atheistic communists. So that was just part of like Cold War propaganda. In the Constitution, what's referred to as the separation of church and state comes from two clauses. One is the Establishment Clause that says that the government shall never establish a particular religion as the government or country's religion. So saying this is a Christian nation and that the government should be a Christian government would violate the Establishment Clause. And this has been used also to get rid of forcing people to pray in schools. This has been used to say it's problematic that we often have tablets of the Ten Commandments on government property, that whenever the government seems to show preference or highlight Christianity, but not other major world religions, it seems to be it's brushing up against the Establishment Clause and making this like a Christian nation when that's blatantly unconstitutional. So there have been many organizations that have fought this. In fact, there is an organization called the Satanic Temple, and it was created by atheists that believe Satan is a symbol for freedom and fighting against repression and authoritarianism of the church and God and interpretations of God throughout history. So they actually have won some cases in basically confronting what's called Christian supremacy that violates the Establishment Clause. So there were many government buildings that had or wanted to put Commandment tablets on the government property, and the Satanic Temple created basically like this Baphomet, this like 7 foot Baphomet statue, and said if you're going to put the 10 commandments, you have to acknowledge other religions, otherwise you're violating the establishment clause. So if you're going to put that 10 commandments tablet, you have to put our statue. And then if American Hindus want, they should be able to put a statue of Ganesha or whatever, and like so on and so forth. And this also has been used to argue against teaching Genesis and creationism in schools, that if you're going to teach Genesis and creationism, that's Christian supremacy, that you need to teach creation myths and ideas about creation from all the major world religions. Otherwise, you are privileging and establishing and giving authority to a particular religion within the political state. The other clause that's referred to as the foundation for separation of church and state in the United States is the Free Exercise Clause, which means the government cannot infringe on your freedom to exercise your religion as long as your religion isn't violating the basic rights of other citizens. So the Satanic Temple also is fighting against anti-choice activists. Because there were anti-choice laws passed in numerous states that required women or pregnant people who were seeking abortion to have to listen to what's that called? A scam. Why can't I think of this word right now? I'm so blanked out. To have them listen to like video recordings of like the heartbeat of the fetus or whatever, and then be read a statement that if they go through with abortion, that they're murdering their baby and stuff like that. When all of that info was not like from a medical establishment, all of that info that the heartbeat means it's a life and that it's a human and blah, 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 and that you're committing murder. That's all of that information was based on religious reasoning. So the Satanic Temple said that violated their belief, which is a part of their religion, that everybody should have complete autonomy and control over their body, and that forcing women or restricting women's access to abortion violated their women's religious rights if women were practicing members of the Satanic Temple. So that's just another example. But yeah, so those two clauses are the establishment of why we see that there's separation of church and state in the United States. So when we talk about, Sharia law in Islam in the United States, I think that should open doors to being critical of how a Christian majority in the United States tries to establish so-called Sharia or Christian Sharia or theocracy in the United States as well. And then here are the questions. We made it to the end. So these were answered at the end of the first lecture, so I'm not going to give like a really detailed answer to them. But what is the relationship between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? And how does Islam perceive Judaism and the Christian tradition? So that's traditionally how have Muslims perceive Jews and Christians. So be able to explain how they're all Abrahamic faiths, that Jesus was a Jew, that typically under Muslim rule, Christians and Jews were viewed as people of the book and granted dhimmi status. So there's a lot that hopefully you'll be able to say there, and it'd be really important for you to understand that. How do the Sunni and Shia groups differ? That was discussed again at the end of the first lecture. It's about mainly the successorship of Muhammad into the first caliph. And what are the 5 pillars of Islam? So those are those 5 practices incumbent on all Muslims, and briefly explain each one. There was a slide for each one. Then what is the Shahada, and explain its significance to Muslims. So you should be able to mention that is actually one of the 5 pillars of Islam. What it says, that it's a creedal statement, and then explain the content a little bit about the monotheism of Islam and the and Muhammad is the last in the chain of prophets, or the seal of the prophets. So that is it.